Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take your reading list, those articles, that research, maybe just some notes you've got, and we really pull out the core insights for you.
Yeah, the stuff that matters.
Exactly. It's your shortcut to being properly informed. And this deep dive, it's tailored for you, looking at the 2025 OECD Economic Survey of Ireland.
That's right. It's a pretty hefty report from a major international body looking at, well, everything economic in Ireland.
It is. And our job today isn't just reading it out, obviously. It's about finding the key takeaways, maybe the surprising bits,
Giving you that real sense of what's happening.
without drowning in jargon. So let's get into it. This OECD report. What's the main headline about Ireland's economy right now?
Okay, well, the first thing they mention, and it's something you see a lot, is that the main GDP figures, they can be pretty volatile, jump around quite a bit.
Right, the multinational effect.
Exactly. That dominates the headlines. But, and this is the interesting part, if you kind of look beneath that, the actual domestic economy, what's happening here on the ground, is actually doing pretty well, quite robust.
Okay, so forget the roller coaster headlines for a second. The everyday economy is strong. What's behind that strength?
It really comes down to the labor market. It's incredibly strong. The OECD points out a record high employment rate back in Q3 2024.
A record high.
Yep. And unemployment was near its lowest ever level, so basically more people working than ever before. That makes a huge difference.
Yeah, you can see how that would boost things.
Yeah.
Okay, that's now. What about looking forward? What are the OECD's predictions we should be aware of?
Well, for 2025, 2026, they're actually projecting pretty solid growth to continue, both in that headline GDP, but also in what they call modified domestic demand.
Right, that's the one that strips out some of the multinational noise, gives a clearer picture of the Irish economy itself.
Precisely. And they think that growth will be helped by, well, maybe less volatility from the multinationals, that tight labor market staying strong, and crucially, inflation easing off.
Ah, inflation, the big one for everyone lately. What's the forecast there?
They're predicting headline consumer price inflation settling down to around 1.8% for both 2025 and 2026.
1.8. Wow, that'd be quite a drop from recent years.
It would. Significant relief for household budgets if that plays out.
But there are always ifs, aren't there? What risks do they flag? What could potentially throw a spanner in the works?
Yeah, they definitely highlight some downside risks, things like geopolitical tensions, maybe weaker global demand hitting our exports. That's one side.
Okay, the external stuff.
And then domestically, they worry a bit about capacity constraints. Can we actually keep growing this fast? And of course, the risk that energy or food prices could spike again, pushing inflation back up.
Right, so it's not all plain sailing. A decent outlook, but definitely some clouds on the horizon.
That sums it up pretty well.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit. Government finances, fiscal sustainability. What's the OECD assessment there? Is the state managing its money well?
Well, in the short term, things look okay, mostly because tax revenues have been really strong. Very healthy, actually.
Good news then.
Sort of. But the OECD flags a need for, let's say, more fiscal restraint, more careful management. They point out that about half the cost of living measures in budget 2025, they weren't targeted.
Meaning the money didn't necessarily go just to those who needed it most.
Exactly. And they also note that the government's own domestic net spending rule looks set to be breached again, which kind of raises questions about sticking to the plan.
Untargeted spending, breaking your own rules. Doesn't sound ideal for long-term stability, does it?
No. And the OECD pushes for better medium-term planning, strengthening the whole fiscal framework. Maybe more binding rules, stronger guardrails to work alongside those new EU rules.
So tighter controls, more accountability.
And stronger political commitment to actually follow those rules. That's seen as key.
Makes sense. Are there specific spending areas causing concern?
Yeah, they mention repeated spending overruns, especially in health. It happens quite often.
Health spending always seems to be a pressure point.
It is. And the problem is, those overruns mean there's less money left for other crucial things like capital investment, building infrastructure, schools, hospitals. It crowds out other priorities.
Okay, so managing current spending affects future investment. What about the income side? Taxes. Is Ireland's tax base looking healthy and stable?
That's another area they highlight as, well, a potential vulnerability. The tax base is quite narrow. meaning we rely very heavily on corporate tax from those multinationals we talked about. That can be volatile, unpredictable.
Right.
And interestingly, they note about a third of income earners don't actually pay income tax or the USC, the Universal Social Charge.
A third.
Ah.
Wow. So the burden falls quite heavily on the remaining two-thirds.
It does seem concentrated, yes.
Hmm.
And the OECD suggests thinking about how to make the tax system more resilient.
How? What do they propose?
Developing a roadmap, basically. A plan to diversify where the government's money comes from over the medium term.
Diversify how?
Things like maybe broadening the base for income tax and VAT so more people or transactions are included. Looking again at property taxes, maybe higher rates, and carbon taxes too.
Spreading the load, essentially, making it less reliant on one source.
That's the idea. Create a more stable foundation for public finances.
Okay. Now, the report also mentions the National Development Plan, the NDP. That's a huge spending plan, right? How does that fit in?
It is huge, about 165 billion euros allocated between 2021 and 2030. It's for major projects, housing, climate action, digital infrastructure, really important stuff for the future.
But also a massive financial commitment.
Absolutely. It puts significant demands on the budget, especially when you factor in other long-term pressures.
Like what? What other big bills are coming down the track?
Population aging is a major one. The number of people over 65 compared to those working age, the old age dependency ratio, that's set to roughly double by 2050.
Double. That's huge pressure on pensions, healthcare.
Exactly. And then there are the climate targets. Achieving those ambitious goals, like net zero, will require massive sustained investment over decades.
So, big future costs looming. Is the government putting anything aside for this? Planning ahead?
Yes, the OECD does mention the new funds, the Future Ireland Fund, or FIF, and the Infrastructure, Climate and Nature Fund, the ICNF.
Right, using those windfall corporate tax receipts.
Precisely. The idea is to use some of that unexpected extra money to build up savings specifically for those future demographic and climate-related costs. It's a form of national saving.
Okay, so some long-term planning happening there. Good. Let's switch gears now. Cost competitiveness. How attractive is Ireland for business, and how affordable is it for people? What's the OECD's take?
This is where some concerns start to surface more strongly. They worry that ongoing labor and skills shortages could really start to bite, hurting our cost competitiveness.
If businesses can't find staff, or have to pay way over the odds.
Exactly. It pushes up costs, makes us less attractive compared to other countries.
We hear a lot about shortages. Any specific examples highlighted?
They give a stark one for construction, needing around 50,000 extra workers by 2030.
50,000. Just for construction.
Just to meet the targets for building new houses and retrofitting old ones. It shows the scale of the challenge, especially for housing, which we'll definitely come back to.
Wow. Okay, so what's being done about these shortages?
Well, the government's using employment permits to bring workers in from abroad. They're looking at the salary levels needed for those permits right now, plus making it easier for spouses or partners of permit holders to work too. And crucially, they stress the need for lifelong learning, vocational training, upskilling our own workforce.
Right, training is key for the long run.
Yeah.
What about the cost of living side for workers? Does that impact competitiveness?
Oh, definitely. High costs make it harder to attract and keep staff. The OECD specifically calls out childcare costs.
Still very high here, right?
Yes, even with more state funding and subsidies recently. And they point out that access isn't equal. It varies a lot depending on your income. That can stop people, especially parents, from working. And high childcare costs feed into wage demands, too.
Yeah, it's a big chunk of many family budgets. Any other workplace issues mentioned that affect costs or competitiveness?
They touch on reforms to improve working conditions, things like the move towards a national living wage, statutory sick pay improvements, better parental leave.
All positive for workers, presumably?
Yes, but the OECD notes the need to balance that social equity aspect with the potential impact on business costs, especially for smaller firms. It's a balancing act.
Always is. Okay, slightly different angle on competitiveness. The legal system. Why does the OECD look at that?
Because inefficiency there adds costs for everyone. They raise concerns about how long court cases can take in Ireland and how high legal fees can be.
Right, delays in big bills aren't good for business.
Or for individuals, obviously. It creates uncertainty, adds expense, and can just generally slow things down. It's a drag on the economy.
What's causing those delays and costs?
They mention things like digitalization in the courts still being incomplete, information systems being a bit fragmented, not joined up.
The tech issues.
Partly. They also mention efforts to get more judges in place to handle the workload.
Makes sense. Any bigger ideas for reform in the legal sector?
They float the idea of reforms to boost competition, like allowing multidisciplinary practices, law firms working with accountants, for instance,
Interesting.
and even the possibility of having licensed conveyancers handle property deals, not just solicitors. The goal is more competition, hopefully leading to lower costs.
Modernizing the professions a bit. And lastly, on competitiveness, what about just general red tape for businesses?
Briefly mentioned, yeah, the ongoing need to ease the administrative burden, paperwork, compliance hoops, and also strengthen public integrity. Basically, make it easier and fairer to do business here.
Okay, so competitiveness isn't just one thing. It's labor, costs, childcare, legal system efficiency, red tape, a whole mix.
Absolutely.
Right, let's move to another huge topic, climate change. Ireland has ambitious targets. What's the OECD's view on our progress and challenges?
They acknowledge the targets are ambitious, definitely. That 51% emissions cut by 2030, climate neutrality by 2050, big goals.
Right.
But the big challenge now, they stress, is moving from planning to doing. Implementation. We need clear timelines, proper accountability, less talk, more action, essentially.
Where does that action need to happen most urgently? Which sectors are the big emitters here?
Transport, buildings, and agriculture. Those three together are the lion's share of Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions. That's where the focus needs to be.
Okay. And our energy system. How's the shift to renewables going?
It needs to speed up significantly. We need better ways to manage electricity demand, and we need to accelerate renewables deployment. The target is 80% renewable electricity by 2030.
And where are we now?
Around 44%, so a long way to go in a pretty short time. Offshore wind development plans are ambitious and crucial here.
Okay. What about those other big sectors? Agriculture is a tough one, isn't it? Over a third of emissions.
It is tough. The OECD mentions ideas like pricing mechanisms for methane, the main agricultural gas, and more incentives for planting trees, afforestation.
And transport.
Yeah.
Getting people out of cars.
That's the goal. The avoid, shift, improve approach. Avoid unnecessary journeys, shift to public transport or cycling, improve vehicle efficiency with EVs, but they admit our spread out population makes the shift part really hard.
Yeah, public transport isn't an option for many outside cities. What about buildings? Making homes more energy efficient.
Retrofitting. Huge focus there, but it needs to be scaled up massively. They talk about needing standardized approaches, making financing easier for people. And they also see potential for district heating in urban areas, but say we need a proper regulatory framework first.
Lots to do on buildings. Now, carbon tax is meant to drive change. How effective is it, according to the OECD?
Well, it exists, and it's scheduled to rise to 100 euros per ton by 2030. That's significant.
There's usually a but.
But its application is uneven. Some big emitting sectors, like agriculture and buildings, face relatively lower effective rates. And crucially, we still have fossil fuel subsidies in place, estimated at 3.5 billion euros in 2022.
Subsidies that work against the carbon tax.
Pretty much. It sends mixed signals, to say the least. Needs more consistency.
Definitely sounds like it. Finally, on climate, it's not just cutting emissions, it's adapting to the changes already locked in. How are we doing there?
There's a new national adaptation framework, which is good, but the OECD says we urgently need standard ways to measure how well we're adapting. Proper monitoring indicators.
So we know if the plans are working.
Exactly. And we need to make infrastructure transport, buildings more resilient to climate impacts like flooding or storms. They also briefly mention the role of private insurance for climate disasters.
Okay, so climate action needs implementation, consistency, better monitoring, and focus on adaptation too. It's a massive agenda.
It really is.
All right, let's tackle the issue that's probably top of mind for so many listeners, housing. What's the OECD's headline assessment?
They don't mince words. Ongoing housing affordability and availability issues are seriously impacting people's well-being, and they're also hurting Ireland's economic competitiveness. It's a major drag.
We feel it every day.
Yeah.
Are we building enough houses now? Is supply catching up?
Completions have increased recently, which is positive. They acknowledge that.
Good.
But there's still a major imbalance between supply and demand. Deep structural problems remain. And they highlight a worrying trend. Homeownership rates are falling. 69% in 2023, down from higher levels.
Fewer people owning homes?
Right.
That's a big societal shift. What's fundamentally driving these high prices and rents?
It boils down to supply not keeping pace with demand over many years. The number of households forming has grown faster than the number of homes being built.
Simple maths, really.
Pretty much. And that imbalance pushes prices up. They note real house prices grew, on average, 5.5% per year between 2013 and 2023, much faster than incomes grew.
Yeah, that gap is the killer for affordability. How do our housing costs compare internationally?
We spend a higher share of our household budgets on housing-related costs than the OECD average. Even with supports for some, the overall burden is high.
So the government's plan is housing for all. What does the OECD make of its various schemes and goals?
They recognize the plan exists and its different parts trying to support first-time buyers, boost supply, tackle affordability, make the system more sustainable. They mention specific things like the Affordable Purchase Scheme, First Home Scheme, cost rental.
Schemes trying to help different groups. But is this housing crisis just a problem for individuals, or does it hurt businesses too?
Oh, it definitely hurts businesses. The OECD is clear on that.
Hmm.
High housing costs fuel wage demands, obviously.
Right?
They can also make other goods and services more expensive indirectly, and critically, it restricts labor mobility. Businesses, especially those attracting FDI in cities, struggle to get staff if people can't afford to live nearby.
So it's a direct brake on economic growth and attracting investment.
Absolutely.
What about planning for future needs? Are the targets in housing for all ambitious enough?
The OECD suggests maybe not. They stress the need for really accurate, up-to-date assessments of housing need, and they think the initial targets might have underestimated demand. Local authorities should see these assessments as minimums, not just baseline figures.
Aim higher, basically.
Yeah.
What about property taxes? Could they play a bigger role? LPT, vacant homes tax.
They discuss these. The local property tax, the residential zoned land tax, vacant homes tax. The OECD suggests there could be scope to maybe increase the rates or apply them more broadly.
To encourage land use and get empty homes back into circulation?
Potentially, yes, using tax as a lever to influence behavior and supply.
Okay. Turning to the actual building process. Planning permission delays are legendary. What does the OECD say?
They acknowledge the challenges. They welcome the new Planning and Development Act from 2024, which aims to speed things up, introduce statutory timelines.
But
But a big bottleneck is staffing. Local authorities struggle to hire and keep qualified planners. Without enough staff, even the best system won't work efficiently.
need the people to make the process work. What about what we build and where? Density, urban sprawl.
They mention the new guidelines pushing for more sustainable, compact development, higher density, focusing development in cities and towns, but with some local flexibility. And the Town Center First scheme gets a mention, trying to revive town centers. But a fundamental problem, they point out, is the lack of good, standardized national data on how land is actually used. Hard to plan strategically without that map.
Better data needed again. What about the rental market? Huge pressure there too.
Yeah, they cover the private rental sector, affordability trends, obviously, but also the concerns of smaller landlords about regulation maybe driving them out.
Tricky balance.
Very.
Yeah.
They suggest maybe exploring more flexible regulations, but only alongside a massive push to increase the overall supply of rental homes. Supply is key.
And the construction sector itself. Can we build faster, cheaper?
Needs to happen. The OECD points to bottlenecks, labor shortages, again, productivity issues. They back initiatives like boosting apprenticeships and using modern methods of construction, MMC.
Off-site building standardization.
Exactly. Things that can speed up delivery and potentially lower costs. They also stress the need for way more social and cost rental housing, moving away from relying so heavily on allowances in the private market. Funding reform is needed there, too.
And homelessness.
Briefly mentioned, yeah. Along with the need to streamline how social housing is allocated to get people housed faster.
Wow. Okay, it's clear housing is just incredibly complex, needs action on planning, tax, construction methods, social housing supply.
Yeah.
Everything.
It really is a tangled web. No single silver bullet.
So we've dived deep into this OECD survey. If you had to boil it down, what's the single biggest message our listeners should take away?
I think the core message is this. Ireland's economy has shown real underlying resilience, which is good, but it's facing some seriously big interconnected challenges. We're talking about managing public money responsibly for the long haul, staying competitive globally, delivering real climate action, and crucially, fixing the housing crisis.
Interconnected is the key word, isn't it?
It really is. And navigating all that successfully isn't just about having plans. The OECD makes it clear. It's about effective, consistent implementation of those plans and reforms, getting it done.
Execution is everything.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully this deep dive has given you, our listener, a much clearer picture of the challenges and opportunities outlined by the OECD.
Yeah, a solid overview, the key insights without getting totally lost in the weeds.
So here's something to chew on. We've talked about how linked all these issues are: finance competitiveness, climate, housing. If you had to pick one area, based on what you've heard, which do you think is the absolute most critical focus point for Ireland's future well-being and prosperity? Think about the knock-on effects, the trade-offs. What's the linchpin?
And look, if this has sparked your interest, the full 2025 OECD Economic Survey of Ireland is out there. Definitely worth exploring if you want the granular detail.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.